Israel says it's carrying out airstrikes on Gaza to defend itself. But according to the UN, the right to self-defense belongs to people living under occupation. So, are international laws being respected? And where does that leave Palestinians who are fighting for their rights? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. More than 200 Palestinians killed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. Residential buildings flattened, homes destroyed, and water supplies running out. Israel says it's targeting tunnels and military facilities in self-defense following rocket attacks by Palestinian factions. 10 people in Israel have been killed in the past week. Hamas says its actions were in response to the Israeli policy of forced displacement of Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem and the storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli forces last week. And that spread into fighting between mixed communities of Jewish and Palestinian-Israelis. The UN is warning the fighting could unleash an uncontainable security and humanitarian crisis. International calls for a ceasefire have been mounting. Palestinian and Israeli officials both made their case at an emergency meeting held by the Security Council on Sunday.
When you embrace your children and grandchildren tonight, please think of our children and of how you can honor those killed and spare those still alive. Think of what it feels to see your world crumbling down and not being able to protect them. Think of what it means to sleep not knowing which one of you will wake up. Remember that each time Israel hears a foreign leader speak of its right to defend itself, it is further emboldened to continue murdering entire families in their sleep.
This is not the first time that Hamas has indiscriminately fired deadly missiles at Israeli civilians while hiding behind Palestinian civilians. But this time, it's different. It was completely premeditated by Hamas in order to gain political power. It was all a part of their vicious plan. While Hamas seeks the destruction of the state of Israel, it's also vying to take power in the West Bank and to replace the Palestinian Authority.
Well, let's hear from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who says to end the violence, the peace process needs to be restarted.
International law applies to everybody without exception. All member states are supposed to abide by the resolutions, namely the resolutions of the Security Council. And obviously, the unity of the Security Council is an extremely important instrument. The recent incidents demonstrate how important it is to restart effectively the peace process, because it's the only way. I'm a true believer that we need to promote a two-state solution, living in peace and harmony between the two, and with normalized relations with the region and the full participation of the countries of the region and the international community as a whole in creating the conditions for this peace process to move forward.
Well, the US and Western capitals have backed Israel's right to defend itself, while other nations say the Palestinians' right to defend themselves is being ignored. That right to self-defense for people living under occupation is grounded in international law, and it dates back to 1982, when the United Nations passed a General Assembly resolution that recognized the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. Let's take a quick look at other liberation movements throughout history. Algeria was colonized by France from the 1800s until the War for Independence in 1954, when the National Liberation Front fighters launched an offensive against French rule. The movement gained international support, and Algeria was recognized as a sovereign state in 1962. The 1960s also marked a turning point in South Africa in the fight against apartheid, the system of government that separated people based on race. Anti-apartheid groups maintained resistance, with some using guerrilla warfare. Apartheid ended in the early 1990s, and a democratic government was formed in 1994. In Ireland, in the early 1900s, the Irish movement's struggle against British rule led to the deaths of hundreds of people, including civilians. But its cause gained popularity and led to the establishment of a breakaway government in Ireland in 1919. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Messina, Tristino Marignello is a reader in law at Edge Hill University in the UK and member of the legal team representing Gaza victims before the International Criminal Courts. In Cape Town in South Africa, Tim Murthy is head of peace-building interventions at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. And here in Doha in Qatar, Sultan Barakat is director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute. Welcome all to the programme. Sultan Barakat, if I could start with you. Now, the Israelis do not consider themselves to be an occupying force, but as we've just been hearing, in international law, they are regarded as such, right?
They are. I mean, it is definitely an occupied territory as far as the law is concerned. Now, there are different interpretations by the Israelis that really got some momentum following the 1988 withdrawal of Jordanian sovereignty over the occupied territories in the West Bank. Now, and those basically what some Israelis claim is that the land practically was occupied from Jordan. Now there is no country demanding the liberation of that land. And as such, we are not quite as an occupied force. And that this, of course, contradicts all the norms of international law, as far as I'm aware. And the definition of occupation goes as back as the 19th century and has been built on repeatedly, which refers to any territory that is controlled under the authority of a hostile army. And in the case of Palestine, of course, this hostility continues, and they are in control of the land, and as such, that brings not only the right for resistance for the Palestinians, but also a huge amount of obligations and responsibilities on the Israelis to protect human rights, to protect properties, to definitely not to destroy properties and forms of culture and so on of those people, and certainly not to colonize it and do any unilateral annexation of such territories or move populations to live in those areas.
Okay, Tim Murthy, in South Africa, we'll draw on your own experience in South Africa in a second, but the overriding narrative in Israel, as we heard in the United States as well, and various other nations, is that Israel has the right to self-defense in the face of rocket attacks in Gaza.
Well, the principle of self-defense is established in international law as well. But I think the principle of self-determination does override, such a consideration. It doesn't help that the Katyusha rockets are, in fact, flying straight into Israeli homes, because it does make the moral case much more difficult. But I think this is quite a complex situation that we need to be, quite focused in terms of understanding how we've had a series of multiple violations happening on both sides, and also a failure of the international system. I think we need to put that on the table to actually be able to mediate and come up with a solution, a enduring, sustainable peace that can, in fact, enable these two communities to coexist. And I think it's important to look at the role of powerful actors in the United Nations system, the P5, notably the United States. And here what we see is as the administrations in Washington change, then almost the posture towards Israel also changes, and we should raise the question: why is this happening so shortly after a transition in Washington? And what really can the international system do to address this crisis?
Okay, we'll look at that a little bit later. Cristina Marignello, you know the law very, very well. So if you have occupied, suppressed Palestinians, as they are, but if Palestinian factions are firing rockets on Israel, as Tim was just alluding to, are the Israelis not within their rights to try and stop them and take out the source?
Well, that's a very good point and also controversial issue under international law. As you were correctly saying at the beginning, first of all, armed organized resistance movements in Palestine have the right, clearly under international law, to put in place all lawful means, including struggle against colonial or the occupying power, which is Israel, of course, in this case. I would like to add also to what my colleague was saying before, that not only the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is under occupation, but also the Gaza Strip, not because I say it, but this is widely recognized by international organizations, including the UN, where despite this engagement, Israel still exercises an effective control over the Gaza Strip. The problem in relation to self-defense is when self-defense is claimed as a consequence of wrongful acts which are clearly put in place by Israel here. Israeli authorities are putting in place a widespread and systematic attacks against civilian population, both in the West Bank and including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. So the claim here of self-defense is a direct consequence on wrongful acts that they are putting in place, and that's where their revendication under international law becomes problematic.
Right. So are you saying that if Hamas are firing rockets because they've been, poked and provoked and provoked, with settlement buildings and crackdowns in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, that we can classify the firing of rockets in that situation by Hamas and Palestinian factions as self-defense?
I'm saying that international law recognizes the role of organized resistance movements, going back to the Geneva Convention 1949, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, Article 1.4, which explicitly provides that it's an international armed conflict, the conflict in which people fighting against colonial domination and alien occupation are involved. In this context, in which these actors are recognized, even organized resistance movements, they have to comply with international humanitarian law principles, in particular the principles of distinction and proportionality. So Hamas cannot put in place any indiscriminate attack intentionally against civilian objects. Of course, even organized resistance movements have to comply with the general principles under international humanitarian law. There can be no derogation for anyone on this, in relation to this.
And Sultan Barakat, so the Palestinians defending themselves from a kind of overall oppression rather than initially a direct attack on Gaza?
Well, they're defending themselves from an overall systematic occupation that is trying to push them out of their land and to replace them with communities that are brought from all over the globe in the name of religion. So they have a very clear case, I think, in terms of legality of the situation. And even if you were to think about what's going on in Gaza and Hamas resisting, under international law, as I understand it, even if there is a resistance and the occupier is not in full control of the territory, that does not make their obligations in terms of international humanitarian law any less. They still have to go back to the law of war, and the 4 Geneva Conventions apply. And that at the center of those is the respect for human rights and the respect of ownership and property and everything else that is in the occupied land. And in fact, a very important aspect of it is that the law that should be implemented in that area is the law of the land. It's not the law of the occupier. So you bring in, it is your duty to sustain law and order, but ultimately it is to start with at the law of the land. And what Israel's been doing is they've suspended the law of the land, or selectively taken here and there, and they went back as far as the Ottoman laws, to take and to put together what suits their cause, what suits the idea and the agenda of the Israelis. And this is what led us to where we are today. What we're seeing in Sheikh Jarrah is not just started in the last week or so. This is a systematic approach that has been taken ever since 1967 with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza.
This is the forced evictions you're talking about.
Before that, of course, in terms of the 1947-48 territory. But since the recognized occupation of West Bank and Gaza, Israel has not upheld any of the international standards, and certainly have not upheld or materialized or implemented any of the UN resolutions that were referred to by Guterres in your report earlier.
Okay,
Israel has the largest number of resolutions that are extremely explicit and very clear, black and white. None of them has been respected. None of them has been upheld.
Okay, we're going to look further at the illegalities of the process of justice in a second or two. But Tim, in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, I should say, Tim Murithi. So what parallels can we draw with South Africa and what people went through there during the era of apartheid, and indeed which led to Nelson Mandela leading an armed wing of the ANC?
Yeah, so I think it's very important to historicize these conflicts and not simply pick a moment in time and try to understand the different dimensions to it. So the legality of the occupation has been established. I think that's very important. And in South Africa, it was similar. It was the illegality of the apartheid white supremacist regime, which in fact separated peoples in South Africa on the basis of the color of their skin. And what you see in Palestine is similar, separation taking place. Walls to divide communities, passes and checkpoints, to control the movement of people. And that is why we've seen this parallel with apartheid South Africa being made with the current situation in the occupied territories. In South Africa, ultimately, Nelson Mandela, many people actually remember more as a peace builder, as a reconciler, was the first leader of the armed wing of the African National Congress, the Umkhonto we Sizwe, in 1961. And he led a campaign of assaulting installations of the apartheid state. The level of casualty was nowhere near what we see today in Palestine, but it was a concerted campaign, a military campaign, to try to take on the apartheid system. But what became clear very quickly is that there's an asymmetry of power between the state apparatus and, a armed militia that is made of movements that have come together. It's important to say that the ANC armed wing wasn't the only armed movement. There were the Pan-African Congress and AZAPO, for example, were also involved in military struggles against the apartheid state.
Okay, Tim, I'm just going to jump in there because we need to move it on. The very interesting points that you make. Sultan, just come back to you briefly. Is apartheid going on now in the Palestinian territories?
Sure. I mean, if you take it apartheid as definition, if we go to the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, it literally says that apartheid is any inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining the domination of one racial group over another. And this is what is going on within the occupied territory, certainly, and even within Israel. And this is a discussion that's been going on for some time. It has gained more momentum in the 1970s, and the General Assembly resolution on this is very clear. That was passed in 1976, and more than 109 states are parties to this convention. Now, of course, Israel's position would be that we're not party to this convention, but they're not party to a lot of conventions that are there to regulate the conduct of war and to regulate the relation of the state to its people. And this is, of course, because the nature of the state, it was the way it is done, the way it is thought about as a dynamic entity that is growing day on day and is acquiring land. And this is happening against the background where the Palestinians, right from 1973, have been presenting compromises. If you recall, back in 1988, the PLO agreed or accepted the two important UN resolutions, 242 and 338. And that came following the peace agreement that Egypt had with the Israelis, and also the Arab states having recognized PLO as the only legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and then the separation that happened between Jordan and the occupied territories to pass that responsibility onto the PLO. So that has led them into a road which then kickstarts the Oslo Peace Agreement in 1993, which was seen as a process, and the hope that this process would lead them into an end to the conflict. And instead of doing so, it has ended just as a process. They've made many, many compromises, and the return has been negligible.
Okay.
And as far as they're concerned, it's been the opposite. They've lost their land. There is no practical way of having now two-state solutions because of the fragmentation of the Palestinian land, because of the colonization.
Sultan, I need to move on. I need to move on. We're coming towards the end of the program. But Tristino, so we have this ongoing apartheid, which is a daily fact of life. Then we have this latest bout of aggression in Gaza. What elements of what we're seeing in Gaza might constitute war crimes?
Well, I think that going also back to the question before, every state has the right to self-defense, but no state has the right to commit war crimes against humanity and genocide. Here, what's happening these days, in the past few days in Gaza, there is clear, strong evidence already collected by Palestinian NGOs that there are ongoing war crimes committed against the civilian population in Gaza, exactly like it happened in 2008, 2009, and 2014. The military operation are following exactly the same approach. This approach was already denounced by UN Commission of Inquiry in 2009 and 2014, clearly establishing that Israeli authorities were responsible for war crimes. War crimes here means mainly intentional, indiscriminate attacks against civilian population and civilian objects. In 2014, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court already collected evidence of more than 3,000 incidents which may amount to war crimes, and on which there is already an ongoing investigation before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Now there is evidence that these crimes do not belong to the past, but are daily committed. We can clearly provide the examples of the attack to the TV station broadcasting building in the Gaza Strip, where there is no military necessity and no military objective. Civilian objectives are attacked or indiscriminate attacks without any military necessity to schools, religious sites, and residential area.
Christina, I'm going to jump in there again because we've just got a minute left on the program, and I want to finish up with Tim. So Tim Murthy in Cape Town, just very briefly, if you would, in the end, what brought change in South Africa? What can we learn from the peace process there to apply to the seemingly impossible dream of peace in the Middle East?
In the end, it was Nelson Mandela, who was the military commander, that in fact transformed himself into a negotiator, a peacemaker. He established a peace agreement with the South African apartheid regime, and in fact became a reconciler after that as the first president of South Africa. So what we need in the occupied territories, in Israel as well, are for people to in fact become themselves, Mandelas in terms of their quest to reach out and to build bridges. The military approach is unfortunately not going to get us anywhere. We're going to see more buildings destroyed, and we're going to see more lives lost. So I think this is the enduring lesson from South Africa. Even though it's not perfect, it is a model that we should be exploring much more deeply in terms of trying to have a sustainable solution to the situation in the occupied territories in Israel.
All right, gentlemen, we have run out of time. Do appreciate your time joining us to talk about this important story. Thank you to our guests, Cristina Marniello, Tim Murthy, and Sultan Barakat. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That is facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here in Doha, it's goodbye for now.